Scary telling. I've always been fascinated by old, abandoned houses. So, when I heard about a dilapidated mansion on the outskirts of town, I knew I had to check it out. But little did I know, that decision would change my life forever. As I made my way to the mansion, a feeling of unease settled in my stomach. The closer I got, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel a sense of dread growing inside me, but I pushed it aside, thinking it was just my overactive imagination. When I arrived at the mansion, it was just as I had imagined it would be, a grand, old building, long since forgotten. It was surrounded by an overgrown garden, and the trees cast eerie shadows on the crumbling walls. I pushed open the rusted gate, and as it creaked, I felt a chill run down my spine. Inside, the mansion was even more unsettling. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. As I explored the abandoned rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Eventually, I found myself in what appeared to be the master bedroom. It was a large room, with a four-poster bed, a dressing table, and a wardrobe. But it was what I saw on the wall that made my blood run cold. There was a shadow, cast by something that wasn't there. It was in the shape of a person, but there was no one in the room with me. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and continued exploring the mansion. But every room I entered, I saw the shadow on the wall. It was always there, casting an ominous presence over the room. As the sun began to set, the mansion grew darker, and the shadows grew longer. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I began to hear whispers in the silence. That's when I saw her. A woman in a white dress, standing at the end of the hallway. Her face was pale, and her eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. I was frozen in fear. She began to walk towards me, slowly, deliberately. As she drew closer, I could see that her dress was stained with blood. But as she reached out to touch me, she vanished into thin air. I ran out of the mansion as fast as I could, but I knew I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched followed me, and the shadow on the wall haunted me. Even when I returned home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. But the feeling never went away. The shadow on the wall still haunts me, and the whispers still echo in my ears. I know I'll never be free of the mansion's curse. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still see the woman in white, her eyes glowing in the darkness. And I know she's waiting for me. It was the summer of 1992 when I was asked to house-sit for a wealthy family at their sprawling estate, Blackwood Manor. The job seemed too good to be true, a paid vacation in a luxurious mansion for a few weeks. Little did I know, it would become a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Upon arriving at the mansion, I was struck by its eerie stillness. It was as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I shook off the feeling and began to settle in. The first few nights were uneventful, but soon strange things began to happen. It started with small things, like objects moving on their own or doors opening and closing by themselves. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but it became increasingly difficult to ignore. I felt like I was being watched at all times, and the air felt thick with a sense of dread. One night, I woke up to find a figure standing at the end of my bed. It was the silhouette of a woman, her eyes fixed on me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me shaken and terrified. I soon discovered that the mansion had a dark history. It was rumored that the previous owner had murdered his wife and children before taking his own life. Some claimed that their spirits still haunted the estate, seeking revenge for their untimely deaths. As the days went on, the haunting grew more intense. I could hear whispers in the hallways and the sound of footsteps in empty rooms. Doors would slam shut and the lights would flicker on and off at random. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. But the worst was yet to come. One night, I woke up to find the figure of the woman standing in front of me once again. This time, she reached out and touched my face, sending a chill down my spine. Her touch was cold and clammy, and I could feel her breath on my skin. I tried to move, but I was paralyzed with fear. It was then that I realized that the spirits in the mansion weren't just angry, they were vengeful. They wanted me gone, and they would do anything to drive me away. But I refused to give in. I refused to be chased out of my own job. I began to research the history of the mansion, determined to find a way to put the spirits to rest. It was then that I discovered a hidden room in the basement filled with the remains of the murdered family. I knew then that I had to give them a proper burial to finally lay their spirits to rest. It was a risky move, but I knew it was the only way to end the haunting. With the help of some local historians, I organized a proper funeral for the family. As the caskets were lowered into the ground, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The spirits of Blackwood Manor had finally found their rest. Years have passed since my time at Blackwood Manor, but I still remember the haunting like it was yesterday. I've never been the same since. Every creaking floorboard, every whisper in the dark reminds me of the spirits that once haunted me. And yet, I'm grateful for the experience. It taught me that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for redemption. I had always heard stories about the old abandoned house at the end of the lane. People in the town had whispered about strange noises and inexplicable occurrences happening in and around the property. But I never believed in any of it until one summer night when I decided to explore the house with my friends. We walked down the dusty lane, and as we approached the house, a chill ran down my spine. The house was old, dilapidated, and had a sinister aura around it. We entered through the broken front door and shone our flashlights around the dark and damp interior. The place was a mess, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling and furniture covered in dust. As we explored the house, we heard a strange noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like a child crying. My friends and I exchanged worried glances, and we slowly made our way up the stairs, our flashlights lighting up the way. The crying grew louder, and we found ourselves in a room that was almost empty, except for an old, rusted crib in the corner. That's when we saw a ghostly figure of a young girl sitting on the floor and crying. She was dressed in an old-fashioned dress, and her face was twisted in sadness and despair. We tried to speak to her, but she didn't respond. Suddenly, she stood up and pointed to the window, which had been boarded up. We turned to look, and as soon as we did, we heard a loud bang. The boards had fallen away, and we saw the ghostly figure of a man outside, looking at us with empty eyes. My friends and I screamed and ran out of the house, but as we did, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I turned around to see the little girl's ghostly form right behind me. She whispered in my ear, "He's been waiting for you. He'll never let you leave." And then she disappeared. We ran back down the lane, our hearts racing with fear. But as we reached the end of the lane, we realized that we were not alone. A group of ghostly figures surrounded us, including the little girl and the man we had seen in the window. They were all whispering in unison, "You're not leaving. You're not leaving." My friends and I were trapped, with no escape. We were doomed to spend eternity with the ghosts of the house at the end of the lane. And as we heard their chilling laughter, we knew that we had made a grave mistake by entering that cursed house. I was a real estate agent, tasked with selling a large, old mansion that had been abandoned for years. Despite the house's obvious beauty and grandeur, it had been passed over by potential buyers for years. I couldn't figure out why until I went inside. The house was filled with dust, cobwebs, and a strange musty smell. But worst of all, there was a room that nobody had ever seen before. It was locked and hidden away, and I couldn't help but wonder what was inside. I couldn't resist the mystery, so I managed to find the key and unlock the door. The room was small and completely empty, except for a single chair in the center. As I stepped inside, I felt an odd sensation like I was being watched. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling only grew stronger. That night, I had a strange dream. I was back in the house, in the forgotten room, but this time the chair was occupied by a shadowy figure. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. It was almost as if it was made entirely of darkness. It reached out a hand and beckoned me closer. I woke up in a cold sweat, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I couldn't stop thinking about the room and the shadowy figure. It was like it was calling out to me, drawing me back to the house. Days went by, and I found myself unable to stay away from the mansion. I would drive by it every day on my way to work, and each time the urge to go inside grew stronger. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back to the house and face my fears. I entered the mansion and walked directly to the forgotten room. I opened the door, and the shadowy figure was waiting for me. It spoke to me in a voice that was both menacing and seductive. It told me that it had been trapped in the room for years, waiting for someone to free it. It promised me riches beyond my wildest dreams if I helped it escape. I was both terrified and intrigued, and before I knew it, I was agreeing to help the shadowy figure. It gave me instructions on how to free it, and I left the mansion, feeling like I was in a daze. That night, I carried out the instructions the shadowy figure had given me. I went back to the mansion, and in the forgotten room, I completed the ritual. Suddenly, the shadowy figure burst out of the chair, its dark essence flooding the room. I was both fascinated and horrified as the shadowy figure grew in size and power. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, and I could tell that it was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. In the end, I had to make a choice. I could help the shadowy figure and gain the riches it promised, or I could try to stop it before it destroyed everything in its path. I chose to fight the shadowy figure, but it was too powerful for me. In the end, I had no choice but to run, leaving the mansion behind. To this day, I still can't shake the feeling that the shadowy figure is out there, waiting for its next victim. And I know that it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. I never used to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. That was until the night I went to investigate the abandoned house on the outskirts of town. I had heard the stories, the rumors about the old mansion that had been vacant for decades. It was said that the previous owner, a wealthy and reclusive man, had died inside, and his spirit still haunted the halls. Despite my reservations, I decided to check it out. I arrived at the house just as the sun was setting, and the sky was a beautiful shade of pink and orange. The house loomed ominously, and the air was thick with an eerie silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine. The air was musty, and the furniture was covered in thick layers of dust. It was like no one had been inside for years. I started exploring the house, room by room, and as I went deeper inside, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. I could feel the weight of something watching me. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a faint creaking sound coming from upstairs. My heart racing, I climbed the stairs to investigate. The room at the end of the hallway was the source of the noise. I opened the door, and as I stepped inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The room was pitch black, and I couldn't see a thing. But then, I heard a voice, a low, rasping voice that whispered my name. I froze, unable to move. And then, out of the darkness, I saw it. Two glowing eyes, staring at me from the shadows. I stumbled backward, tripping over something on the floor. When I looked back up, the eyes were gone, and the room was empty. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something had been there with me. I tried to leave the house, but I found that I was trapped. The doors and windows had all been locked from the inside, and I was unable to escape. It was then that I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps that echoed through the house. I followed the sound, and it led me back to the room with the glowing eyes. But this time, there was something else in the room, a figure, hunched over in the corner. It was the ghost of the previous owner, and it was angry. I tried to run, but the ghost was too quick. It cornered me in the room and started to close in, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. I knew I was going to die. But then, something strange happened. The ghost stopped, frozen in place. And then, it slowly began to fade away, disappearing into the darkness. I was finally able to leave the house, but the experience had changed me. I could feel the darkness that had followed me back into the world. The ghost may have been gone, but its presence was still with me, and I knew it would never leave. From that day on, I was haunted by the memories of that night and the fear of what might still be lurking in the shadows.